Welcome to the biannual George Mosse Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Ofer Ashkenazi. I'm a Mosse visiting professor here from the Hebrew University. I've been affiliated with the program in various capacities since 2002, so it's always great to be back. Inaugurated in 2002, the Mosse series aimed to continue Mosse's legacy of research and teaching that utilized cutting-edge scholarship and addressed key, sometimes controversial issues in a manner accessible to a broad audience. The series normally alternates between the two institutions where Mosse taught and wrote, University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And over the years, starting with Christopher Browning's first lecture, the series featured some of the most distinguished scholars in our field, Martin J., Celia Applegate, Dagmar Herzog, Jan Assmann, and I can go on and on. But instead of that, you can go outside, not now, but when we're done, you can go outside and see some of the books that came out of this lecture series. And all the lectures are recorded and can be listened to on their website, on the Mosse program website, which it's just Mosse program. Yeah, exactly. All right, and now I have the utmost pleasure to introduce the 2025 Mosse Lecture Series speaker, Johannes von Moltke. Johannes received his PhD from Duke University in 1998 after completing his undergrads in Dartmouth College. It's really problematic to mention publications because there's so many of them. So I will just mention a few that I find especially interesting. I'll start with two monographs. One is No Place Like Home, Locations of Heimat in German Cinema from 2005, the winner of the MLA Prize for Best Book in German Studies. And the Curious Humanist, Siegfried Krakauer in America from 2015, which also won the Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award. This project of Krakauer, or adjacent to the project on Krakauer, there are three anthologies of Krakauer's writing that Johannes edited and co-edited. I'll read the titles: Cultures in the Anteroom, Legacies of Siegfried Krakauer, Siegfried Krakauer's in America. Siegfried Krakauer's American writing, and Siegfried Krakauer's Grenzgänge. Over the past few years, Johannes also co-edited the English edition of the last letter exchanged between his grandparents, Helmut and Freya von Moltke, from 1944-1945. It's hard to say that it's fun reading, but it's really excellent reading. Johannes von Moltke is the president of the American Friend of Marbach and was the president of the German Studies Association. His most recent work, he is studying the right-wing media culture and been following the media tactics of populist right in both sides of the Atlantic, and we will hear about it today and in the next couple of days. I mentioned that the series normally alternates between Madison and Jerusalem. This event was supposed to take place in Jerusalem. It was sadly postponed first and then moved here because of the devastating war in the region, which in itself has to do, of course, with the rise of populist right-wing radicals. When we had to move it, I thought it was a shame because I thought it's especially relevant. The topic is especially relevant for what is going on in Israel. However, fortunately, it is highly relevant here too. So brilliant. All right, thank you very much. Johannes, please.
Thank you, Ofer. I'm extremely pleased to be here. I'm grateful to you all for coming and also for having me. It's my first time in Madison, which seems weird because Ann Arbor and Madison seem to me to be somehow mirror images of each other in certain ways. And in addition to the similarity of our big state institutions, there's also work that we do together. So there's a lot of friends in the room, and it's nice to see you again. And former students, also great to see. And I'll launch right in, but I also will say at the outset that I'm grateful for the opportunity to think in this way. I've certainly never done that before, to think across 3 lectures in this way. I'm impressed by the format. I've been a listener once in one such format at the University of Michigan, where the anthropologists did that, and it was, to me, very inspiring. I'm not sure if I can live up to that. Was my colleague Webb Keane, who's a really brilliant anthropologist, and we kind of learned about his book that way, and I thought that's pretty amazing. So I also know that it involves a certain kind of commitment from the audience, and I appreciate. I'm not expecting everybody to be at every lecture, but for those of you who are doing that, know that I appreciate it. Okay, so I'm going to launch right in, and then I will take a minute halfway through to say something about where Ofer just left off. But let's start in Vienna. On an overcast day in November of 2023, a small group of activists staged an event on the ramp leading up to the main entrance of the University of Vienna. Freshly incorporated as the Aktion 451, Action 451, it's just on the outside here. The group had seized upon the university's refusal to host a lecture by Götz Kubitschek, head of a small but influential think tank in the East German village of Schnellroda, a name you'll hear lots over the next few days. Kubitschek holds a teaching diploma in German, geography, and philosophy, but he had hardly been invited to speak for his academic qualifications. Rather, it was the New York Times anointed prophet of Germany's New Right, whom a small group wanted to hear. Often carelessly described in his own preferred authoritarian language as the right's Vordenker, or thought leader, Kubitschek had traveled to Vienna at the invitation of a group of right-wing students linked to the far-right Austrian party FPÖ. And it was in the party's parliamentary meeting rooms that he would end up speaking later that day about Ray Bradbury's novel Fahrenheit 451, same number you see there up on the right. But the university's refusal to host this event proved to be an opportunity too good to pass up. And so Aktion 451, so named after the titular temperature of Bradbury's dystopian novel at which paper catches on fire, Aktion 451 took to the ramp, a public space at the university's doors. Arriving in a tram under police protection, the group scuffled briefly with protesters before taking up their positions under a banner bearing the Marquis de Posa's famous demand to the absolutist ruler in Friedrich Schiller's Don Carlos, Sire, geben Sie Gedankenfreiheit, or Sire, give freedom of thought. His freedom of speech ensured and enforced by a massive police presence, Kubitschek then mounted the steps to complain that he was prevented from speaking about die Sache, the substance, or in this case, Ray Bradbury's novel, and forced instead to speak about die Umstände, the circumstances. And yet, reviewing the footage of the event online and the subsequent reporting, it's difficult to escape the conclusion that the public performance of grievances was precisely the substance that Kubitschek and Action 451 had been after from the start. Underwritten by a political party, Kubitschek's appearance on the ramp amounted to a partisan attack on higher education. In his brief remarks on the steps, he railed against, and I'm quoting, the coddled academic proletariat, das verfettete akademische Proletariat, whose cancel culture, his terms, had allegedly silenced him. Never mind the fact that he was speaking out, would speak again later that night, and speaks incessantly in publications and public appearances throughout Germany and Austria. Kubitschek's intervention, his performance, is familiar enough by now as a tactic in the culture wars. Choose a cultural value or venue, weaponize it rhetorically, and make sure your action finds ample distribution through social and other media. This is not, I hasten to note, a right-wing tactic per se. In ways that we'll discuss tomorrow, the new right has learned and borrows quite explicitly from an older new left. Somewhat more remarkable, however, was the cultural practice that was at stake that day in Vienna. Die Sache, it turns out, the substance that Kubitschek allegedly could not talk about, was not simply one particular novel. Rather, it was the act of reading itself. Proscribed in the dystopian world of Fahrenheit 451, the great cultural technique of reading forms a centerpiece of Kubitschek's own activities as a publicist. The group that took its inspiration from Bradbury's tale, in turn, interpreted the cultural technique of reading as resistance, intimating that their own right to read had somehow been curtailed. The handful of demonstrators who had turned out in support of Kubitschek on the steps of the university chanted, "Freedom of thought is not a crime." It works better in German. Meinungsfreiheit ist kein Verbrechen. Bum, 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 bum. While Kubitschek spelled out the stakes of reading, now anchored clearly and explicitly on the right. And I quote Kubitschek, "We must read. And we must read one novel after another, one central work of literature after another, appropriating it for our purposes, reading it from a right-wing perspective, and turning our reading towards the reconquest of the university." End of quote. At his lecture later that day, Kubitschek would go on to illustrate how such reading might proceed. On one level, it involved simply recounting the plot of Ray Bradbury's novel about one man's heroic resistance to bibliocide by incineration. In the future world of the novel, firefighters have been repurposed not to put out conflagrations, but to burn books wherever they find them. As he walked his listeners through the novel, however, Kubitschek insisted on a second, allegorical level, asking the audience to consider what, quote, we should think alongside or into the novel in connection to the times in which we are living. On the face of it, this was again an ecumenical, nonpartisan, though potentially politicizing, critical approach to literature. Kubitschek was advocating for a form of reading that's familiar enough, one that emphasizes the value of critique and sees literature as a socially symbolic act whose political unconscious careful reading can draw out. In keeping with his earlier call for an instrumentalizing kind of reading, however, for a reading that appropriates literature for right-wing ends, Kubitschek made quite clear how he intended to use Bradbury's novel. Over the course of his lecture, he treated his listeners to neo-fascist dog whistles involving coy references to the number 88 and to the great concept of the university ramp, die Rampe in German. If you just say die Rampe, there's really only one association you can have, and that's to Auschwitz. And there's a kind of, you can hear him with a particular satisfaction just saying it the way you would say the N-word to needle people if you're of that persuasion. He offered connections to the alleged victimizations of COVID demonstrators and mused about the rampant, quoting Hannah Arendt's term, banality of evil that stifles right-wing causes. In a kind of reversal, of which we'll see other examples in the course of these lectures, Kubitschek laid Bradbury's critique of tyranny, written in the wake of fascism and the Red Scare, at the feet of democracy, now reconceived as a repressive authoritarian regime calling for the kind of heroic defiance embodied by the novel's main protagonist, Guy Montag. Exploiting the many-faceted nature of literature and the subversive potentials of reading that any literary critic would have to admit, Kubitschek turned Fahrenheit 451 into a parable of right-wing resistance, as clear a demonstration as you could ask for of what it means to, quote, read one novel after another from a right-wing perspective, quote, appropriating it for our purposes. For those purposes, Bradbury's novel is paradigmatic in that it furnishes what Kubitschek calls a cipher for action. And by cipher, he literally means number, the titular degree under which the self-styled Aktion 451 organized that day. Branded on the web and in public space in red, white, and off-black, Action 451 sloganizes its activism by yoking it to the act of reading. Wir lesen und wir handeln. We read and we act. And then below it says, mach mit, join us. As even a cursory glance at the group's website reveals, it fully embraces Kubitschek's call for right-wing appropriative reading. In fact, the site uses images from the action on the university as banner graphics, integrating the public performance, it's right behind the title, integrating the public performance and its medial infrastructure into the circular feedback loop that only reinforces the performative character of it all. But again, that performativity has a content spelled out on catchy stickers and programmatic about us pages. Together with the sporadic blog posts that populate the site, these materials conceptualize books as weapons, ein Buch ist eine Waffe, and reading as a multiply overdetermined activity best practiced collectively. We are readers. We read intensively, without blinders, and together. The reading groups that Aktion 451 stood up for this purpose across Germany, Austria, and Switzerland were designed to poke a finger in the eye of academia. These were to be right-wing safe spaces, which would brook no truck with extreme leftist, old cultural, or neo-Marxist notions of the university, and which would tolerate no gendering or anti-white ideologies. All quotes from the website. While there's reason to doubt the longevity and impact of Aktion 451, whose most recent blog post dates back to September 2024, and its reading group calendar ends in February of last year, its activities fit squarely into the cultural politics of the New Right. The group, such as it is, seems emblematic in several respects. Not only does it explicitly formulate a politics of literature, books, and reading that scholarship on the New Right has come to identify as one of its central platforms, and we'll come back to other versions of this reading politics throughout these lectures, but the self-stylization of Aktion 451 also evinces a number of other key characteristics of the New Right in the way it mobilizes against higher education, orchestrates events in urban spaces, networks across platforms and media, adopts an aggressive strategy of self-victimization, and instrumentalizes culture. Espousing a politics of reading that is networked, dissident, anti-academic, and readily weaponized, Aktion 451 exemplifies what the New Right calls its metapolitics. This term, who's familiar with this term, metapolitics? That's interesting to me. It's fewer than I would have expected, but it shows how far down this rabbit hole I've fallen. I've thought that this... so I would have assumed that it would be familiar to many in this room, which would have been significant in its own right. But for those of you who aren't fluid in alt-right newspeak, let me briefly gloss the notion to which I'm devoting these lectures before going any further in discussing the forms that metapolitics takes, the strategies it adopts, and the historical dimensions it more or less consciously invokes. We owe the concept largely to the work of Alain de Benoit, a key thinker of the French Nouvelle Droite, but it may be useful to begin with its pithiest formulation, which comes from Andrew Breitbart, of Breitbart News, founder of Breitbart News, succeeded by Steve Bannon. Especially in circles on what was then the alt-right and now the New Right, the founder of Breitbart News is often quoted as saying that politics is downstream from culture. Metapolitics, accordingly, happens upstream from politics in the cultural realm. It's a realm that becomes construed as meta in the sense that it is above, beyond, or before politics. And the translation into German is often vorpolitisch, pre-political, rather than metapolitical. In the patently instrumentalist sense in which Breitbart intended his catchphrase, there's a strategic interest in commandeering cultural positions to realize political gains downriver, so to speak. For that purpose, staging a protest to weaponize reading at the gates of a university is like tapping a river at its source. And this is the point where I think I'm going to step out and say that, and acknowledge the elephant in the White House. The fluvial language of sources and downriver effects also encodes a temporal metaphor. In the flow of time, metapolitics comes first and politics comes later. But later is now, and whatever happened upstream is now feeding the fire hose from which we've been forced to drink daily. In other words, you'd be justified in objecting that there's very little that's meta about the politics we're experiencing. And that's something I've been grappling with in some version ever since tumbling down the rabbit hole of cultural Marxism, another conspiracy theory, in the context of a graduate seminar on critical theory almost a decade ago. In researching the cultural politics of what we were then calling the alt-right, I was often confronted with the sense of my findings and current events leapfrogging each other in ways that made it difficult to pin down my research questions and maintain the distinction between scholarship and journalism, for which I don't really have any qualifications. All of which is to say, in keeping with Ofer's point that this feels somehow relevant, that may be both of interest to all of us in this room, but it's also a sort of research problem to me. And I'm keenly aware of the thin and perhaps sometimes artificial line that separates metapolitics from right-wing politics and policy. If I hold fast to that line nonetheless, it's in the hope of providing some orientation that might be useful for navigating the river that Breitbart would have us imagine by stepping out and surveying it from the banks, so to speak, even as it continues to rush past. Such orientation, if we can gain it, would be both conceptual, my question is what are the guiding concepts of metapolitics, and temporal in the sense that I'm interested in what earlier histories it also perpetuates. While I wouldn't want to claim any simple cause and effect, which I consider one shortcoming of this river metaphor, right? It's just you pour in culture upriver and you get politics downriver. I do think isolating metapolitics as an object of analysis can help us answer how we got to this point. Think of my investigations into metapolitics then as dedicated to a prehistory of the present Trumpian cataclysm. I'll leave it to you and to our discussions over the coming days, if you like, to draw out the implications for our present moment, some of them glaring, others perhaps still submerged in the muddier waters upstream. So back to Breitbart's river, which condenses and simplifies Benoit's earlier theoretical derivation of metapolitics from the work of Italian communist Antonio Gramsci and of Benoit's compatriot Louis Althusser, minus the Marxism, of course. Drawing on Gramsci's martial vocabulary of class struggle, Benoit described metapolitical organizing as a strategy in an all-out war of position and a cultural revolution from the right, the title of the German translation of his book from the mid-'80s. This publication is from the mid-'80s. Benoit significantly really starts his activity and his writing right after '68, and we'll get back to that. In a reversal of the classical Marxist assumptions about the secondary importance of culture and ideas, the so-called superstructure, Benoit considered the occupation of cultural terrain and the redefinition of a cultural common sense a necessary precondition for acceding to political power. For this strategic analysis, the Nouvelle Droite in France drew also on the thinkers of the New Left that it opposed. Besides Gramsci, it was Louis Althusser's concept of the ideological state apparatus, a system that interpolates or hails the subject into structures of power, which becomes for the new right a device in their toolkit. Tweak the apparatus, and you can use it to reprogram the process of interpolation towards right-wing hegemony. Dominate the intellectual airspace, so the thinking goes, and you can march in the political ground troops. This is a long game. Benoit likens it to the burrowing of termites, or Marx's mole, that methodical animal whose tunneling prepares the ground for a new order. For Benoit, writing in the wake of 1968, that ground in need of shifting is defined as democratic and politically leftist, the two things he wants to change. Metapolitics, then, takes advantage of the affordances of liberal societies, their liberties, to burrow underneath and overturn what the New Right after 1968 considers a left-wing cultural hegemony. Unlike fascist propaganda in a totalitarian state, metapolitics as a concept depends on the openness of democratic structures, on the civil rights and freedoms of expression, of assembly, even of protest and resistance, as my opening example was meant to show. As Benoit puts it, quote, "The liberal Western regimes are by their very nature poorly protected and indeed entirely unarmed against metapolitical incursions into mentalities, culture, and common sense." Already during the 1970s then, Benoit's writings on metapolitics were sounding the motif of weaponizing democracy against itself, turning liberal affordances against the very social order that guarantees them, the better to polarize an ideologically unmoored, pluralist society and gradually shift it towards an authoritarian right. If right-wing metapolitics thus inherits from Gramsci and the New Left the patient long march through the institutions, unlike metapolitics, which Gramsci never used, the long march through the institutions is a phrase from Gramsci, it operates simultaneously with a countervailing temporality characterized by urgency, impatience, and a sense of acute crisis. This temporal horizon fuels the activist dimensions of metapolitics, hammered out in the staccato with which Steve Bannon punctuates his podcasts, now closing in on their 5,000th episode, action, action, action. He has it up there too. And you can buy swag that has it too. This is what I would call the accelerationist leading edge of metapolitics, which is not so much the opposite of the long game I described above, but its flywheel, an underlying motor force that boosts momentum of conceptual burrowing. Acceleration itself is a term first developed on the left as a Marxist heresy that was to point away beyond the impasse of neoliberal stasis, of the exhaustion of revolutionary energies, or of the end of history. Heighten the contradictions inherent in capitalism, so the thinking went, and you hasten the advent of revolution. Originally a philosophical term of art, accelerationism has been gaining traction as an umbrella term for gaming the game and creating chaos within a socio-political order to bring about its ruin. In their 2013 manifesto for an accelerationist politics, for example, Alex Williams and Nick Snurchek call out the exhaustion of traditional politics and the need to recover a sense of futurity by, I'm quoting from this manifesto, unleashing latent productive forces of the very capitalist order they decry. So this is an anti-capitalist accelerationist manifesto. Eschewing any whiff of reformism, they paint a starkly Manichaean choice of either bringing about a globalized post-capitalism through acceleration or settling into, I'm quoting them again, a slow fragmentation towards primitivism, perpetual crisis, and planetary ecological collapse. Where sociologists such as Hartmut Rosa have cautioned against the noxious effect of acceleration, or think of Jonathan Crary's 24/7, and lifestyle movements seek refuge in slowing down everything from cooking to urban life, accelerationists seek to force the issue by ramping up instead. Casualties along the way are so many calculated risks, collateral damage, including not only the liberal order, but also democratic institutions. Quote, "The overwhelming privileging of democracy as process needs to be left behind." Such latently authoritarian tendencies in left-wing accelerationism account for the concept's appeal on the new right, as does the manifesto's avowed anti-neoliberal stance. Reading the text 10 years on, this is from 2013, I think, one is struck by the degree to which its progressive leftist agenda has been adopted by the new right, which jettisons the notion of climate or labor crises, but embraces the idea of generating a new global hegemony against neoliberal fragmentation and globalization. "Let's desire the crisis," writes the same Götz Kubitschek we encountered earlier on the ramp in Vienna. In this vein, Donald Trump was seen explicitly as, quote, the accelerationist candidate by white nationalist voters, and like Elon Musk, he has been explicitly labeled accelerationist in the press. Someone like Steve Bannon would wear the term as a badge of honor. And I have to, although I had the good fortune of spending a semester at the American Academy in Berlin last year, which afforded me the time to listen to One Too Many Steve Bannon podcast. I have not listened to all 5,000 of them, and I wouldn't be surprised if he hadn't also read something like this, like engage in some way with accelerationist literature. And somebody can do the digital humanities work on that, because you can just run the transcripts through a language AI. But I can't. The philosopher Nick Land, who is credited with pioneering the notion of accelerationism, has since become identified with the racist far right, espousing increasingly supremacist positions under the banners of dark enlightenment or neo-reaction, sometimes shortened, if you've seen it on social media, as NRX. On the militant fringe of the new right, accelerationism tends explicitly toward civil war. But the metaphoric language arguably extends beyond even such a cataclysm to a full-blown nihilistic fantasy. In the words of one right-wing militia member, the goal is, quote, to just make the world glow, dude. Everything's going to have to be annihilated, man. End of quote. This is from, I get that quote, which I used as the title for the lecture, from the literature that now exists on, from counter-terrorist scholarship getting worried about accelerationism and its ultimate consequences. We saw it in Michigan. This is, I think, from the group that in Michigan was seeking to assassinate Gretchen Whitmer. We see it in the Bugaloo movement. We see it in the Proud Boys. Acceleration and millenarianism, then, sit comfortably alongside the slower activities, such as developing concepts, methodically burrowing into the institutions of civil society, generating a right-wing counterculture, and moving the Overton window, an oft-used term on the new right, for shifting the boundaries of the sayable, if not common sense itself, to the right. The concept of metapolitics, which isn't a term, as I said, that Gramsci ever used, and with it the idea of achieving cultural hegemony, which is Gramsci's term, has been described by scholars of the new right as the, quote, most hegemonic of all radical right concepts. Strategically developed by far-right thinkers of the past half-century, metapolitics routinely crops up in writings, speeches, podcasts, memes, and videos well beyond the French intellectual circles from which it originated. In Austria, the erstwhile leader of the Identitarian movement, Martin Sellner, has made it the cornerstone of his call for a regime change from the right. And in the United States, to add just one prominent example, now buried under layers of that fire hose I mentioned, because it's from 2016, the white nationalist Richard Spencer celebrated the alt-right's contribution to Trump's first presidential victory by noting that metapolitics is more important than politics. And this is, if you recall, this is Spencer giving a speech that ended in the Hail Hitler. And I just looked at it again because it's relevant with Musk and Bannon doing the Hitler salute, and it's actually not. It's very interesting because it's in that case it wasn't Spencer who did it; it was all the listeners. Just this month, Steve Bannon hosted New Criterion editor Roger Kimball to explore Trump's attack on the institutions of culture through a Gramscian lens. This is where he's saying, tell us what your book, in your book, what was Gramsci talking about? What were you talking about Gramsci? If you spend a lot of time on these sites and listening to this stuff, it gets very repetitive. So you get things get so rote that you do have a sense that nobody's reading. For all the reading that they're claiming to do, nobody's reading Gramsci. Now, the very currency of metapolitics as a notion indexes the success of the strategy it names. The fact that the term appears to have entered our political vocabulary, whether through Benoit, Bannon, or Breitbart, Zellner, or Spencer, is part of what the metapolitical project seeks to accomplish. Infuse the language with terms like metapolitics. it would consequently be a mistake to construe the concept of metapolitics as a formal, politically neutral description of all sorts of discursive mobilization, as if it were just another term for the politics of culture, or the culture wars. And I spent a long time writing these lectures, which is great because it forces you to organize your thinking. I spent a long time writing and then cutting a part about metapolitics and the culture wars. Is it the same thing or is it different? Because the culture wars is a term that we're all familiar with. We're kind of bathed in it. And I do think, that's instructive and we can talk about it later, but I do think metapolitics is the more precise term. And it shouldn't be confused with, cultural politics or culture wars. For metapolitics no longer relates to politics, if ever it did, in the way that metaphysics relates to physics. Apparently that's how the term was first coined in the 19th century, I think by de Maistre, like a French conservative thinker, who said we need a concept of metapolitics to think about the political, in the way that we can think about metaphysics as something above or beyond the physical world. Instead, I believe we must now consider the relationship between metapolitics and the political in roughly the same way that gender ideology, or as it's called in Europe, genderism, relates to gender, or the euphemism remigration, which means deportation on the far right, relates to migration. Only the latter terms, gender, politics, and migration, can serve as categories of social, historical, and cultural analysis. The former terms require analysis in their own right. Or to put this differently, although the term metapolitics does have a history independent of the new right, and occasionally has been advanced on the other side of the political spectrum, there's a book by Alain Badiou called Metapolitics. It is today a term of art and a reactionary political concept. The unmarked use of metapolitics now indexes a right-wing worldview. As such, it signifies not simply a strategy of cultural reconquest, but also transports ostensibly lost values of masculinity, authority, anti-egalitarianism, nationalism, and ethnic homogeneity. So I'm resisting the idea that you could just talk about metapolitics as a neutral concept that you could apply anywhere. It's always already filled. Opposed in name only to identity politics, it is deeply identitarian, ethnonationalist, and, at least in the United States, generally white supremacist. As Alexandra Stern quips, to whom I owe a lot because we started working on this together about 7, 8 years ago, in her book, Proud Boys in the White Ethnostate, she writes, "Metapolitics is white nationalist consciousness raising at the collective level." How then does such consciousness raising proceed? In what manner and through which media does the right pursue the kind of cultural activism that metapolitics describes? What are its sites, its modes, its techniques, its patterns? And what are its principal themes? These are some of the questions I pursue in my research. And what interests me there are as much the semantic details of individual metapolitical utterances or actions as the larger political patterns they allow us to discern. For that purpose, and because of the network dimensions of metapolitics, I find it particularly useful to adopt a transatlantic perspective that allows us to see both the transnational and the nationally specific dimensions of right-wing so-called countercultures. And I say transatlantic because that's my familiarity. I think there are other transnational constructions that would be just as useful. And notably, I've been tracking a little bit of the work that's going on in India around Hindutva nationalism, and I think you can track a lot of resonances there. I imagine that Bolsonaro's Brazil would also provide good examples. And when I say transatlantic, I should be clear, I'm mainly talking about the German-speaking transatlantic. France is ripe for further analysis, and certainly Hungary. This transatlantic or transnational perspective also informs my theoretical orientation, for which I draw on the analysis of an earlier right-wing resurgence in the United States, an analysis by the Institute for Social Research, often referred to as the Frankfurt School. As refugees from Nazism during the 1930s and 40s, scholars such as Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Leo Löwenthal, and others developed an acute view of the Roosevelt era's demagogic capture of populism and what they called, these theorists called at the time, fascist agitation. Today, we would call it metapolitics, and their analysis is newly relevant. That's where I end in the last lecture on Thursday. I like it here, I'm going to stay. With this perspective in mind, my goal for these lectures is to characterize for you the New Right's Metapolitical project by attending to its emblematic sites, its strategies, and its history, or the what, where, how, and when of metapolitics. Obviously, these questions are intertwined, but I separate them out here for the sake of argument. In keeping with the origins of metapolitics in French intellectual circles, and with its explicit interest in the production of concepts, I take my cue from the staging of the protest in Vienna with which I began to identify the university as a key site of metapolitical strategizing, where by university, I mean both the institutions we routinely identify by that name, but also, and probably more importantly, some academy-adjacent sites, platforms, and think tanks created specifically in the metapolitical mold. Think of them as the alt-right, alt-ac, where metapolitics happens. In my second lecture, and I'll give you a quick outline before we end today about some of the sites that I consider significant. In my second lecture tomorrow, I'll ask how metapolitics operates by looking at its rhetorical patterns and recurring strategies, which I will argue are bound up in a logic of aggressive appropriation. And on Thursday, in the final lecture, I will argue for the need to historicize the recent resurgence of the New Right by attending to earlier forms of, as I said, agitation. I'll explain those headings as I go along. What's at stake throughout, I'll suggest, is not just the cultural redefinition of a new right and the blurring of political lines, but the challenge that metapolitical organizing poses for a pluralist democracy, as well as the tools we have at our disposal to describe, theorize, and protect that democracy. Okay, so by way of setting the stage for tomorrow's discussion of how metapolitics works, let me devote the rest of my time today to a brief sketch of where it operates. To be sure, metapolitics is diffuse by definition and design, and it's admittedly difficult to pinpoint its location in a globally networked digital media environment. And yet, I submit that if metapolitics had a home, it would resemble a university. It's not for nothing that the college campus has become the emblematic battleground of the culture wars. This is why Aktion 451 chose the ramp in front of the university in Vienna that day, and it's why organizations such as Charlie Kirk's Talking Points USA target their weaponization of free speech at colleges and universities. And I imagine you can all think of other examples. Metapolitics gravitates towards higher education and academia, even where it espouses anti-intellectual populist platforms. In the US, the downstream effect of this strategy, so if the academy is that upstream cultural space that Breitbart was after, the downstream effects of this strategy on actual policy are evident in the executive orders issued during the first weeks of the Trump administration on everything from DEI to indirect cost recovery at universities, in bids to ban particular terms from government-funded research, in earlier congressional attempts to wrest control from college presidents, in curricular interventions by legislatures from Oklahoma to Florida, or in Ron DeSantis' MAGA makeover of New College, a model and test case for rewiring higher education to the right. We can observe similar political interventions in Europe, where Viktor Orban's illegal ousting of Central European University from Hungary in 2019 certainly inspired some of the attack strategies we're currently witnessing in the US. But arguably more characteristic than the aspirational reconquest of actual universities is the proliferation of virtual spaces for the production and dissemination of metapolitical concepts. Examples abound on both sides of the Atlantic, but occasionally they become distilled into something close to the ideal type of a metapolitical institution, such as the online Gegenuni. This is, I don't have one with there, but here's their logo, GU, for Gegenuni, or Counter University in Germany. Drawing on a long and largely leftist history of open, critical, and counter universities, the Gegenuni was stood up in 2021 for spreading, quote, conservative and patriotic contents. The Gegenuni would offer, quote, a new right diploma and prepare the ground for a political project that at least one prominent advocate considers, quote, synonymous with the reconquest of the humanities. The humanities are alive and well on the right. In fact, they're concerned that too many of their adherents in Germany, which are people organized in these really right-wing fraternities, gravitate toward engineering and econ. And they're trying to pull them over into the humanities. So they're doing our work for us. With connections both to the Identitarian movement in Austria and the AfD in Germany, the Gegenuni deliberately seeks to position itself as an academic adjacent hub of the right-wing counterculture, die akademische Kontrakultur. Directed against the, quote, stuffy and totalitarian climate of opinion, end of quote, left ideological universities, the offerings of the Gegenuni promise instruction in the classics of the interwar conservative revolution, or what one seminar title simply labels as rechtes Lesen, which is right-wing reading, but also right reading. The avowed goal of the Gegenuni is nothing less than, quote, imparting armor and spiritual ammunition for the fight to preserve our homeland. That's a quote from the promotional materials. As if the undertone of all-out struggle wasn't clear enough, an accompanying strategy seminar offers activist training in Macht und Praxis, power and praxis. That's the name of the seminar. The weaponization of right-wing critique is programmed into the Gegenuni's social media presence. Okay, switching over to this side for other examples, given the higher degree of privatization of higher education in the US, the idea of a counter-university here depends less on grassroots organizing than on philanthropy, financing, and politics. Instead of virtual seminars, there is space in the tiered landscape of US universities for institutions like Hillsdale College in my home state of Michigan, or social engineering experiments like New College in Florida. For an online US equivalent to the Gegenuni, we'd have to look to the MAGA version of an American academy floated by Donald Trump during the most recent presidential campaign in the United States. Carefully avoiding the tainted term university for his own venture, Trump used the announcement to attack Harvard and, quote, other once respected universities for, quote, turning our students into communists and terrorists and sympathizers of many, many different dimensions, end of quote. The American Academy, by contrast, promised, again Trump, an entire universe of the highest quality educational content while remaining, quote, strictly non-political. What does that mean? There would be, quote, no wokeness or jihadism allowed. The American Academy would be free to students, financed entirely by taxing the endowments of, quote, legacy institutions. Coming from the namesake of the fraudulent Trump University, the proposal was, to coin a phrase, a bit rich. Never mind the performative contradiction of launching a non-political institution as part of a political campaign, the same contradiction that dogs the more recent incarnation of strictly non-political position-taking in higher education in the name of institutional neutrality and ideological diversity. But then again, as the references to wokeness, jihadism, and sympathizers of many, many dimensions plainly suggest, the pitch was always intended less as a policy proposal, let alone as a viable business model. Rather, the Academy announcement was another volley in the culture wars, another swipe at the left's ostensible cancel culture. It was pure metapolitics. Neither the Gegenuni nor Trump's American Academy appear to have been inordinately successful. Subscriber numbers to the Telegram and YouTube channels of the Gegenuni remain in the low 4 digits, and Trump's campaign promise remains unrealized so far. But both of these initiatives are clearly aspirational, and as such, they spell out rather baldly what other quasi-academic endeavors on the right have been doing more methodically and with greater reach and consequence. For two distinct but related sites of such endeavors on either side of the Atlantic, we might look, respectively, to the small town of Schnellroda, with which I began, and the California-based Prager University Foundation. You might think of Schnellroda as command central of German metapolitics. Schnellroda is here in the eastern part of Germany. The hamlet in Saxony-Anhalt is home to the Institut für Staatspolitik, a far-right think tank, as well as the right-wing publishing house Antidemocratic. Conceived by Kubitschek and his wife, Ellen Kozica, the Institute boasts regular visits from AfD members who draw on it for conceptual guidance, although the term in German is actually geistiges Manna. Is that the English term too, manna? Like I think I associate it with a Orientalist idea of inspiration, enlightenment. I'm not sure how the term translates, but we owe the term, I go to Schnellroda for my spiritual nourishment, to Björn Höcke, the leader of the extreme right of the extreme right. As a metapolitical forge, the Institut für Staatspolitik is devoted to disseminating political concepts and theories anchored in a deeply traditional hierarchical conceptualization of the state, whose worst enemy is egalitarianism. The Institute shares this knowledge through publications and biannual academies that bring together speakers from the right on topics such as reaction, Heimat, democracy, cultural critique, and there was one also devoted to reading, lesen. Costs are kept low, as is the age limit. The academies are designed for attendees no older than 35. The Institut für Staatspolitik is serious about what the Germans call Nachwuchsförderung, or how would you translate that? Germanists in the room, Nachwuchsförderung. Helping the next generation rise through the ranks. And by all appearances, they also were involved in helping to launch and to staff the offerings of the Gegenuni. Media are central to the metapolitical project, and Schnellroda is no exception. Indeed, I'd argue that we fail to understand the Institute if we do not grasp its media strategies, which are constitutive of the overall complex itself. Thus, operations in Schnellroda also include the bi-monthly journal Secession, regular podcasts, a blog, and an eponymous Kanal Schnellroda on YouTube. But the embrace of new media in Schnellroda does not jettison the old. In keeping with Kubitschek's self-presentation as a Bradbury reader in Vienna, the Antidemocratic publishing arm maintains a carefully cultivated investment in reading and literature through the medium of the book, including books on reading, bibliophile projects like the subscription series Kaplaken, here they are on my shelf, thanks to my library, I did not buy them, now in its second decade, and regular online reviews and book clubs under the title Aufgeblättert, zugeschlagen, whose implicit violence is always plausibly deniable by the double entendre of zugeschlagen. So this is their logo up here. It says Aufgeblättert, which means opened up like a book, and zugeschlagen, which means shut like a book, but also punched. And the double entendre is totally intentional, but always plausibly deniable. So much for the various dimensions of this site itself. We'll have plenty of occasion tomorrow to return to the content it produces. The format of the book club brings us back around to the cultural technique of reading as a metapolitical leitmotif. And I want to end on this. This too has transnational dimensions, as the book club crops up again on the other side of the Atlantic as one of the many offerings on the platform PragerU, my fourth and final example of online alt-right, alt-ac spaces. We will revisit its book club tomorrow, too. So for now, let me just wrap up by introducing you to the web portal that hosts the monthly show. Who's been on PragerU? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. OK. Feel free to add in the conversation. You've seen probably parts that I haven't seen. Despite its name, PragerU has nothing to do with an accredited university, but mimics its valuation of knowledge, learning, culture, and discourse. Though you have to scroll to the very bottom of the homepage to find an explicit disclaimer in very non-ADA accessible font. A quintessential purveyor of what one columnist for the New York Times calls the infotainment right, PragerU pushes its pseudo-academic credentials on the About page by claiming that, quote, as a 501c3 nonprofit, Prager University Foundation, in parentheses, PragerU, in quotation marks, offers a free alternative to the dominant left-wing ideology in culture, media, and education, end of quote. That alternative, it appears, consists in, here we have it again, quote, promoting American values through, quote, educational videos that allegedly reach millions of viewers daily. The sparse research that exists on PragerU estimated combined views of its content across platforms at over 5 billion in 2023. With a budget of 72 million in 2024, PragerU explicitly measures its success in, quote, the ideological gains we've made. That's the founder, Dennis Prager. The sparse research on PragerU to date would also appear to prove Prager right, describing the site's radicalization tactics as allowing users to sleepwalk into extremism. The site was seeded by inordinately successful 5-minute videos, marked by high production values and presented under universal design principles that emulate everything from Apple commercials to TED Talks, from Khan Academy to PBS. It hosts various shows with featured presenters, among whom Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro are only, and now I say the most famous, but that's probably just in my world at this point. A video platform that offers a, quote, free alternative to the dominant left-wing ideology in culture, media, and education, end of quote, PragerU makes its mission not the production of knowledge, but, as I said, the promotion of American values. Some of these viewers it produces are certainly children, for whom the site offers countless PragerU Kids pages. Patently modeled after PBS Kids, I think, these pages feature short videos such as Leo and Layla Meet Christopher Columbus, which peddle happy images of colonization as a civilizing mission to the benefit of, quote, vicious warring cannibals. In the 12-minute video, Columbus defends himself. So it's these kids who travel back. They have to do their homework, and they don't know how to come up with it, and so they just travel back in time, and they meet, and so they get it straight from the horse's mouth. And in the 12-minute video, Columbus defends himself against the, quote, accusations leveled against him in school materials that Leo has had to read, been forced to read by his woke leftist teachers, by insisting that, this is Columbus now speaking in the video, slavery is as old as time and should not be judged by the standards of Leo's present. For this, the kind Columbus teaches the kids, is estupido and amounts to throwing away the past for your present values. As an antidote to such relativism, he refers Leo and Layla to his Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. In addition to such content, now approved for use in K-12 curricula in 8 states, many more in the works, according to a website FAQ, PragerU prides itself on its connection with the under 35 crowd. There they are again. And it strikes me that the under 35 crowd was really big, came out really big in the right-wing elections in Germany, both last fall in the regional ones and this week in the national ones. But the educational mission extends also to adults who are invited to brush up on and deepen their knowledge by watching fireside chats with Dennis Prager himself. There's the Roosevelt era again. Or joining the PragerU Book Club, yet another instantiation of the great cultural technique of reading that Kubitschek extolled on the steps of the university in Vienna that day. But for more on this, you'll have to come to lunch tomorrow. Thanks.
All The floor is open for questions, comments.
I'd love to hear from people who've spent time on PragerU, like why, but also what, like whether any of this resonates. And
Yeah. Okay. We have in the back.
Thanks. Yeah, this was just a very quick question, but is there a connection between PragerU and the publishing house that also is known as Prager?
I don't think so. That's not at all. Yeah. It's a legitimate publishing house. Yeah. And Dennis Prager is, yeah, he's a media personality. He's not an academic. There's no academic credentials to this. Yeah. Thanks. I should probably make that point myself. Yeah. Mark.
Well, thank you for a very depressing lecture.
Oh, you're welcome, Mark.
A question which I'm sure you've thought about, and it doesn't seem to quite fit into your comments today, is the extent to which you think about the 1930s. This contrast is made so frequently, but you seem to be talking about something very different now. So I wonder if you would elaborate at least a little bit on that, and maybe even a lot.
Yeah, for the a lot, I'm going to save it for Thursday, that's the last part of the last lecture. But I'll be happy to tease it, so to speak, here. So by the 1930s, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about 1930s Germany? Is that what you're asking?
32, 33.
Yeah, we were just talking about it over lunch. It's hard not to be thinking about that. The 1920s too, as the lead up. You know, if you think about metapolitics really being serious about using the affordances of a liberal democracy to undo it, I think one could look at the strategies that the Nazis used in the movement phase of the 1920s, and I'm very intrigued. Maybe just intrigued myself over the course, but at one point I suddenly thought, what would happen to our reading and understanding of Nazi Germany, and in particular George Mosse's reading and understanding of Nazi Germany, if for his idea of culture as central to the project, we substituted metapolitics. In other words, what if you did a totally anachronistic experiment of reading the present back into the past, but also the strategies? And would you learn something new about the cultural politics of the Nazis, or does it always just work in the forward direction? You study history and then you understand the present. I tend to think it's more dialectical. So we stand to learn something still by doing this kind of work and then thinking what it teaches us about the earlier moment. The reason I asked you, what are you thinking? Are you asking about Germany? Is because, and I'll say more about this on Thursday, is that I think we disregard America's, previous brushes with fascism at our peril. There is so much that goes on in this country. Well, you can start in 1619, but as a kind of racial society. But then when historical fascism makes its appearance in Europe, so much that goes on here in terms of an infatuation with fascism, in terms of an excitement about getting rid of the messiness of democracy. There's a great book called Dictatorship and Democracy by, with H, I forget his name, which really goes into that period, 1929 to 1933, and how appealing the idea of fascism, of authoritarianism was. That's a really important moment. And then really crucial, I think, are the 30s here of Father Coughlin, the radio personality, and it goes well into the 40s and 50s. I'll give an example on Thursday that's jarring simply because you find somebody in 45 worrying out loud about the fascist appeal in the United States. So I'll talk more about that. I'm not sure if am I heading in the direction of an answer to your question? Yeah, okay. Good, yeah.
So this was brilliant, Johannes. This is exactly the kind of conversation that needs to be had. And this digging into the archives of the right wing to construct for us a vocabulary that the right wing uses and has also appropriated from certain left-wing traditions. So that is wonderfully done. One quick connection to the 1930s question that Mark raised, the fascination with fascism, but there was also intellectual exchange. I mean, on this campus, the language buildings, the foreign languages and literatures, Van Hise was also a eugenist. Mm-hmm. And now there is even a plaque saying, that his ideas inspired National Socialist ideas of eugenics. My question was, the reason why I mention is, at the center of your talk today is another elephant that you have mentioned, and that is the university. And I really liked the way in which you described the university, both as the institution that we currently understand, but also the adjacent academies, et cetera, et cetera. Picking up on your vocabulary, since now the entire project of DEI is at the center of white supremacy and ethnonationalism, instead of simply shifting the blame to the Breitbarts and the Bannons, etc., to what extent would you think there was kind of an accelerationist politics, a performative accelerationist politics happening within universities to speed up the process of performative DEI, which then led to its extinction? I mean, this is the idea that the university never really wanted to confront its own racism, even in the 21st century, then added these many frills of DEI offices and DEI associate deans, et cetera, but the investment was then taken away from the humanities. So even if you look at, Crisis in the Humanities, those kinds of books, they never touch upon race. So I think, the central point here is also to confront the idea of race and racism head on, because that's what these people are doing. And last comment, I'm thinking of it with Georg Mosse's later article. It was from the late 80s, called Racism and Nationalism, where he actually does not go back to the 1930s, but thinks about race in the late 80s, early 90s within the United States, and talks about the clarity of messaging that both nationalism and racism have. And that the clarity of messaging is what these people are doing, which the university failed to do.
So I'll push back a little bit on clarity tomorrow. I think we're really deep in a mirror world if we follow it to its logical conclusion or illogical conclusion. But so there's a lot there. The racism and DEI, but also the whole DEI question, and to what degree the DEI project was a diversionary tactic for the university not to confront its own racism. Sometimes the question is it also not confronting its own elitism? This is a really interesting and very complicated question, which we should probably talk about. I'm not sure that I'm here to kind of tell you anything about it, except that I'm coming from the university that the New York Times called out for this, University of Michigan. And I'm fielding multiple calls from especially German journalists really insisting on a different version of your question, which I don't want to conflate them. They're basically saying, isn't this the left's fault? Isn't Trump's attack now the left's fault? Because didn't they go overboard on DEI? That's a different version. I think you asked the question better. So when I hear that question, I say, are you serious? Do you really? Because I'm where you started. the assault right now is a white supremacist attack. That if you read the letter that came from the Department of Education, which I'm sure you did, uses the language of repugnant racism in order to attack DEI project, which is to me, and again I'll say this explicitly, is a form of projection that we've seen before, including in Nazi Germany. This is how it works. Then it was a different kind of racism. It's exactly the same thing going on. That's slightly aside from the question of, was DEI performative in bad ways? Was it overdone? And I think, speaking just from my experience at my institution, that a certain course correction in DEI is certainly part of the package, that linking the DEI discussions to searching universities searching histories of the university is a good thing. We're doing that. I'm still not happy that the project is called Inclusive Histories, because I think it's exclusive histories actually that we should be chronicling. But that's the branding that University of Michigan is doing of its re-scanning of its history.
Here it's called belonging and thriving.
Yeah, okay, exactly. So there was one last aspect I wanted to pin on that, but I've forgotten, so I'll come back to it. But I think it's at the heart of these questions for sure.
I have two questions, and the first one is more like a factual one. Going back to this accelerationist ideology or theories, like, does the climate crisis play any role in these theories? Because I mean, on first glance, it looks like they would think about that. Like, just curious. The second one, what about this intellectualism or pseudo intellectualism that's visible, especially on the German part of your story? So we know the results in places like Thuringia, Brandenburg, where I guess nearly 40% of voters voted for the AfD. Like, I doubt that they have their Antaios books in their shelf. So like, I'm a little bit skeptical about how successful this strategy is, especially if you compare it to what like the Bannons or PragerU, which embraces a more lowbrow strategy, I think. Yeah. So what are your thoughts about that?
Okay, yeah. Then I have to take notes though. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm really curious about the Aktion 451 and their love of reading, and if there's like a corresponding denigration of other forms of media in their group or in other groups. Do they, put reading and literature on a pedestal at the same time that they denigrate movies and television? Are they sort of like cultural elitists?
That goes with Ludwig's question too. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the fascinating talk. I kind of wondered if you could comment on the generational aspect. Like you mentioned several times that this was really aimed at like younger generations, plus of course the university also definitely like aims there. Yeah. So I wondered if you could comment on that. Thanks.
Okay. So I think you both touched on reading and intellectualism as a question. How seriously should we take it? How effective is it? And how committed are they? So at one point, I made the facetious claim that they don't actually read. But it's really striking how much reading gets held up. And there is now some really good research on reading on the right. There was a conference just about a year ago that's now been published, and there's a whole research project on it at the University of Stuttgart. And I think there's a lot to find out there that doesn't fall on the lines of, intellectual highbrow, lowbrow, exactly the way we think of it as, at the university, maybe it's a kind of middlebrow intellectualism. I haven't thought this through, but that that you can have your kind of middlebrow quasi-fascist literature and eat your cake of modernism too. So in Germany they'll talk about Ernst Jünger, who's been canonized as a modernist. They'll talk about Gottfried Benn. They'll go pretty far in kind of canonical literature and try to make hay in this kind of appropriative reading way. Although even that gets complicated, and we don't have time for that. Is it effective? So is it real? I think for some people it's absolutely real. It ramifies all the way down, so it's also about reading to your kids. There's a whole compendium about what we should read to our kids. It's called Vorlesen in German, and it really is about training in the cultural technique of reading. So I think that's quite serious. Does it denigrate other media? No. I think they're totally promiscuous or ecumenical in that way. We read and then we put it on YouTube. And then we create a YouTube channel, and at the same time we try to be on Telegram and on Rumble and Getter, and I mean it's like try to play all platforms at once, which is a kind of dilution. They all get really low numbers, but then you get the AfD showing up for these tabletop discussions about Björn. What did you read on vacation? Björn Höcke, right? So the leader of the far, far right. What'd you read on vacation? And then he apologizes that he didn't read any novels. He just read kind of political literature because he knows novels are really good for you. So that kind of discussion leaves an effect somewhere. And even if it is performative, the performance is political, I think. So that's what I'll say about that. The climate crisis. So accelerationism was about a worry about the climate crisis, in part when it was, the kind of accelerationist manifesto is explicit about it. As far as I can see, that doesn't get picked up on the new right. And that's exactly how fascist ideology works, according to Mosse, who says it's scavenging, right? He thinks of fascist ideology on the model of a scavenger who picks and chooses and then creates a syncretistic new whole. So you can leave, you can take the accelerationism but leave the climate. And I think, certainly the current politics of the U.S. would bear that out. And on the generations, it's remarkable. They are interested in working the under 35 crowd. It's very explicit. You can't get into these academies in Schnellroda if you're over 35. And PragerU was very, very deliberately marketed at a kind of 20-something crowd when it started, or maybe actually college students. You could get your information there. Like, I need a quick fix on Marx, and then you get that fix. Just pick the video, looks good, snappy, quick, and then you can use it for your paper. And then they pushed it down to the kids and up to the book club that I'll mention, which is, I think, pitched a little more at people who've had their education but want a refresher on the classics, sort of. But to be really blunt and simplistic, probably too simplistic about it, but if this metapolitical idea, this river idea, is to work, then you need to start young. That's the basic idea, I think. So, and actually, they say that explicitly. There's some quotes that I had in here that I've cut out where they're really explicit about we need K-12, we need the universities, because that's where people get kind of trained into the ideological state apparatuses, and we need to be doing that rather than letting it just happen.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I have two questions, so forgive me. You can take whichever one you want. First, in your view, what work is class doing in the right's metapolitics, or what work is class doing in your analysis of metapolitics? Because it wasn't really discussed here. And then the second relates to a lot of comments and questions that people have already offered, but to me there's a tension between the Lasch notion of common sense and intellectualism, or elite spaces and elite intellectual production. And so how are you teasing that out? What is the right doing there? Because it sounds like it's a both and, or maybe it's neither. And so I would love to hear more about that.
Zach. Here, Zach. Yeah.
I couldn't help but notice the Aktion 451 speech at the beginning of your talk. The address for the university was Dr. Karl Lügering, which is really kind of darkly ironic. The quote that you framed your talk with from the right-wing militiaman, just got to rank the world glow dude or whatever it was. I couldn't help but think of Klaus Teweleit and his like psychoanalytic reading of Freikorps literature and other like explicitly proto-fascist and explicitly fascist literature. I'm wondering if you identify a common affective drive among these right-wing agitators. The more explicitly violent ones, especially, but also a kind of affective drive of fascism. I wonder if there's a similar kind of psychological structure there.
Yeah, great. I'll start with affect, where there's a really good book by Simon Strick in German called Rechte Gefühle, which is specifically about the mediated production of affect on the right. And that affect kind of envelops, suffuses the engagements in a particular way. In the same way, I think implicitly, that when you hear Kubitschek in that reading in the party headquarters in Vienna, mentioning right-wing dog whistles, how gleefully he's doing it, and that kind of this, wink, wink affect of I'm part of this, I know. I mean, the whole dog whistle logic of affect, I think, is pretty strong overall. And has something to do with the formulation of a sort of vocabulary on the right that gets reproduced over and over again and refined. I mean, we can talk about this tomorrow too, like the production of metapolitical concepts. I mean, some people would disagree that that's conceptual work. Some of it is just producing words. I mean, but that has an effect. That has an affective effect. I think it's a very important dimension of it. And I'd have to. I've never really kind of engaged enough with Teweleit to understand, to like be able to speak cogently about it. Whether that run up to from World War I through the Freikorps to fascism, whether there's equivalence there. Which reminds me also that when we talk about the 20s and the 30s, World War I is not. We don't have World War I 10 years in the rearview mirror right now. So we do have to make adjustments, obviously, when we make the comparisons. Class and common sense. Yeah. I haven't thought much about class, and clearly, I should. Clearly, and I think the questions about elitism and whom does this reach, all in a way talk to class or habitus or social capital. That would be absolutely relevant. I have to think about where in what I know and kind of where in the data I could locate or start locating class without opinionating about it. But it's you're totally right. It's a really important question. I've thought more about the question of common sense, partly because I have a project on that with a colleague in Frankfurt. That's been very interesting. But that's more about the concept of common sense as something that looks both ways. one way to analyze a polarized society the way we have it is that we lack a commons. We lack a sense of the common. We've lost the middle, whatever you want to call it. And so you can't have a democracy without a sense in common, which is Hannah Arendt's analysis of Kant's ideas about aesthetic judgment being really the model on which we can form political judgments. On the other hand, common sense is the term that gets invoked in an inflationary way by populist politicians. I should be careful. I mean, I was tracking the speeches of, both acceptance speeches by Harris and Trump. They're like, I'm going to defend common sense. I'm just doing common sense. Although one of the candidates used the term in a way that made sense, and another one said, if I say it, then it's common sense, which is the opposite of common sense. But anyway, so the other side of common sense is that it's this populist tool, as which it appears on the right. In this, for them, it gets reduced to this idea of the Overton window that I had a quick slide on. The idea that there's a limit around what's sayable, and if you, which is kind of the common sense, the sense that we have in common, or the sayable, and the work of metapolitics is to move that window to the right so that things that were outrageous a month ago are suddenly normal. Not that that ever happens.
All right, our time is up.
Okay.
I just want to, maybe you'll have the chance tomorrow to say a little bit about the end game. What kind of political conditions they want to achieve, what kind of state they want to achieve in the end of it. So this is a teaser for tomorrow. You should come. Please help me thank the